Okay, good morning, everyone. It's just gone 11 o'clock. My name is Matt Crofts. Welcome to today's update on SuperStream. We've got a huge turnout. This is actually our third session on SuperStream. It's fantastic to have so much interest, but it also shows us at BGL that it's a big change with SuperStream. So today I am joined by Anna Tran. Welcome, Anna.
Hi, Matt. Hi, everyone. Happy to join you all today to discuss the SuperStream process.
So Anna is our resident SuperStream expert. Anna's been liaising with the tax office and APRA funds now for over 18 months. So I'm joined by Anna today. She's going to give you a good overview and just some tips and tricks, what to watch out for. We've got roughly about 45-50 minutes today. That should get us through most of the content and give us a bit of an update. Keep you guys informed. So before we get started, my name's Matt Crofts. I head up the Simple Fund 360 product. This webinar is being recorded, so you don't need to take furious notes. Attendees will receive an email after the session completes with a video recording and the slide deck. Questions, please use the Q&A. I've got Krish and Eric from the Simple Fund 360 team. These guys are experts in SuperStream as well. So as I'm going through the presentation with Anna, just feel free, if any question pops up, just type it into the Q&A. We'll answer it as quick as we can. And we might have a little bit of time towards the end to go through some remaining, if there's some themes of some questions. So webinar is being recorded. All right, so a very quick update. We've run 2 of these sessions already, but SuperStream went live with BGL, with Simple Fund 360, and we created a new electronic service address. So electronic service address is just like an email address for the fund, and it went live 28th of September. ATO went live on 1st of October with SuperStream. And the key benefits, why we're moving towards this is everything's going digital. We're looking for a better automated process, better electronic record keeping. We know it's not quite there yet. That's part of the reason we're running these sessions, to educate our clients and how to make it better. And we're also working with ATO, APRA, and the SMSF Association to really iron out some of the kinks, which we'll go through today as well. But end of the day, look, it is going to be a better system. It just needs a bit of time to adjust. So what really happened on the 1st of October, it wasn't the whole new SuperStream system came in. Effectively had contributions before this already, but really the 1st of October was when the roll-ins and the release authorities came into SuperStream. The rollovers cover full or partial rollovers, APRA to SMSF, SMSF to APRA, and SMSF to SMSF. Okay, that's all electronic now. Previously, you used to do a rollover form on paper. 1st of October, it really became mandatory for all the rollovers, excluding, there's only a few small exclusions with rollover transactions in species, family law payments, because normally the family courts will deal with those payments with their own methods, non-complying funds, which is very few that you guys would be managing. And I'll touch on this. There were some changes just on 1st of March, just to acknowledge some of the troubles. There is some temporary relief, which I'll go into, but you really don't want to rely on that temp relief because it's temp. You've really got to move towards this digital standard. This is a good slide to sort of give you an overview of how the rollover part of SuperStream works. All right, it's for those that haven't had any experience with doing a rollover. Effectively on the left-hand side here, you will see that there's really 3 ways to initiate a rollover. And this is why it gets a little bit confusing. You can jump on, or the member can jump onto the ATO online portal through MyGov and initiate a rollover there. You can get your member to initiate a roller with their APRA fund. If it's going from APRA to SMSF, then you can initiate the rollover from APRA. And quick tip, when I speak to most clients, that's the way they're initiating it. There's certainly some concerns around, giving advice as an accountant. And also what we're finding, going to the APRA fund when you're rolling out from APRA to SMSF, generally when the member goes to the APRA fund, it's generally more successful, okay? It's generally more successful because when the member goes to the APRA fund, they'll have to complete KYC, know your client. They'll have to complete certain details. If they hadn't had any interactions for that APRA fund for a while, the APRA fund should trap that when they start doing a rollover. So it means less backwards and forwards. Okay, so first quick tip, generally it seems to be more successful when you do it that way. But the third method you can initiate a rollover, and I guess if you're an SMSF to SMSF, if it's sort of a death benefit or anything like that, or it's a member split, then really the way to do it is inside Simple Fund 360. That third box there, SMSF provider sends an electronic request called an IRR. Don't worry too much about the terminology, but it's effectively a request to the other SMSF provider or to the APRA fund. Anna will go through that and show you how to do that from within the software. Okay, so that's the three ways. What then happens with that request, no matter which way you send it, it then has to receive a response. And effectively, if it's going to an APRA fund, if you're rolling out from an APRA fund or an SMSF, they've got to respond within 3 days. So the message goes through. If that is the transferring fund, they have to verify the details of the SMSF. And Anna will go through this in more detail, but that is a key point. This SMSF verification service, it's broken down into two parts, but it's effectively just verifying that the details are what they are. So it's an ATO SMSF verification service. It's run by the ATO. We look into that service and so do the APRA funds. And it's checking things like name of the fund, bank account details. And at that point, one of the things where a lot of clients have got caught out is when the fund goes to do the transfer, it will actually notify your members over here on the left, okay? So your SMSF members will get an SMS or a text message, is easy to say. So just be aware that when that verification service is triggered, it's sending a text message, and this can cause some concern with your elderly members that they think they may be getting scammed. They'll get a message from the ATO saying, it won't really tell them much. It'll just say your details are being verified. All right, that causes panic. So sometimes it's good advice to get in front of that. If you know that there's a rollover, maybe reach out to the members before that process gets initiated. Okay. And then where people get a lot of confusion is all this bank account details sits outside SuperStream. So the transfer of the payment, that's, and effectively the money moving is not part of SuperStream. Okay, so how do we tie it together? We tie it together, as Anna will show, with the payment reference number. That's how it ties together. The electronic service address is how the transaction goes through, and the bank details go through the normal bank channels, but it's tied together with what we call a payment reference number so that the bank details can match the SuperStream payment details. Okay, so that's a good overview. All right, so what changed with BGL? All right, we went through this in more detail in our earlier webinars, but this is important. We used to use Australia Post for the contributions. Unfortunately, for both you guys and for BGL, Australia Post still haven't built their rollover and release authority. They gave us a heads up that they were planning for November. We didn't want to wait till November, so we had to build our own BGL ESA SuperStream service. So be aware, the BGL ESA moved from Australia Post. There's no extra cost of switching to our BGL ESA, but it does everything. It does contributions, rollovers, release authorities. At this point in time, if you're following this video as a recording, I would check with Australia Post, but right at this date, Australia Post still haven't released any rollover or release authority. So if you're tied to Australia Post with the ESA, just be warned, you won't be able to process a rollover. You'll need to switch to our BGL 360 ESA. If you're with Simple Fund Desktop, we do have some Simple Fund Desktop clients listening in. You will need to switch to Simple Fund 360 or choose a different provider because we did used to support Australia Post on desktop, but it's very limited support. You can still have your contributions going through desktop, but I would advise you to switch to Simple Fund 360 and use the new ESA. All right, feel free to ask any questions. I can see some coming through. The guys will help you with any of that. We'll go through in a bit more detail about switching ESA as well. I'll take you through a demo. All right, so next thing, the good news is there's over 40,000 rollover and release authority messages processed by the new BGL ESA. So we know it works. We know it's had, some challenges for you guys in dealing with your clients and holding their hand, but we also know it's robust and strong, and you can process rollovers without any issue from a technical point of view. We've continued to watch the feedback from webinars and from the feedback channel that's available in 360 and continue to add more features. All right, we've continued to put clearer messages around payments, and we've put more reporting. We know your auditors wanted to get verification, even though it's digital, they still wanted some paper, some PDF reporting. So there's much more detailed reporting than we first launched it last year. So Anna will show you some of that. The other big news that happened, I know you guys are busy with lodgements and many other issues, but you may have missed it. The ATO came out on the 16th of March and did allow temporary relief from SuperStream, but it's only available to SMSFs that can't find a compliant ESA. So if you're thinking about getting this relief and you're using Simple Fund 360, you won't really meet those conditions because there's a available ESA for all your SMSFs. It's free, it's part of the service of BGL. So if you rang the ATO and tried to get relief, they might ask you what you're using and they would direct you back to Simple Fund and our help team to help you register. If you're a desktop client and you want to do a rollover, then they might enable you to get temporary relief. And if you get temporary relief, just be aware it's only for SMSF to SMSF, and it's only for an SMSF fund temporarily if you wanted to roll to APRA. But if you're rolling out from APRA, you wouldn't really be able to get this relief. And you also must write down the call reference number, okay? Because if you're going to go back to paper and the auditor looks at it later, you want to have a call reference number of why you've done that. So really only available temporary and really only available in limited cases if you really can't get an ESA. If you're running an Excel spreadsheet or something like that, there is limited options out there until Australia Post comes on board with their ESA. And I imagine when Australia Post comes on board, the temporary relief is probably going to be removed. Okay, so we'll keep moving. These are some of the common questions I get and our support team get. Should I switch my funds to BGL's ESA? I was saying earlier, if you look back at my webinar earlier, I was saying, look, you've got a bit of time. Now what I'm saying is I would, now without Australia Post still haven't released, I would say yes, switch, prioritize those that you're going to switch. If you're expecting rollovers or if you're expecting the fund to wind down, switch those first, get on top of those. If you've got pension funds that may be doing some smaller rollovers, switch those next, and then probably look at those that don't have any contributions, are in full pension mode, switch those next, and then those that have got contributions, probably leave those last, just because, it's a little bit extra hassle when you switch. You've not only got to switch in the software, which I'll show you in a sec, but you must notify the ATO of the switch, all right? You must go onto the ATO portal and notify them, or you can lodge a tax return, an annual return, that will notify them as well, but you can't always time the tax return. You know, it's a little bit hard if you're going to roll over and you haven't got a tax return due till 2022. You're going to need to notify them on the portal first. You also should notify the employer if you've got contributions. That's why I'm trying to give you those tips in which order to switch to the new ESA. You could always just do it in a big batch as well, but just be aware you've got to update the payroll so that they've got the new ESA as well. An important tip here that Anna informed me of is if you switch from Australia Post, so you've been using Australia Post ESA, you then switch to BGL's new ESA, all right? This is only if you switch from Australia Post to BGL. We will reroute the contributions because we will know that the ABN switched. We will reroute the contributions from Australia Post, even if you haven't updated the employer. So those contributions, we'll look for them and we'll automatically load them into Simple Fund 360. So it gives you a little bit more time to notify the employer if you're switching from Australia Post, okay? So hopefully that makes sense. If you're switching from some other provider to the BGL ESA, then we can't reroute the contributions. I would still recommend that you contact your members, contact the payroll provider to switch the ESA, but just be aware we will be rerouting. I don't know how long we can reroute, hence my statement there. There's no additional cost for switching to the BGL ESA. The benefits are all the fact that you can get release authorities, much more automation, much more, if you want to use digital work papers, all the data comes through and stores in Simple Fund 360 in a very secure place. You don't need to worry about doing rollovers outside BGL 360. It may be possible that you find a provider, but you would have to store that information outside Simple Fund 360. So much more benefit in doing it all in-house. Other questions I get, can I have 2 ESAs? Well, this is part of the problem. Sometimes it may actually occur that you've got 2 ESAs, but that's going to cause you a nightmare. If you've got an ESA with the ATO's recorded 1 ESA as Australia Post, but you've got the ESA recorded in Simple Fund 360 as BGL's ESA, that's going to cause you a problem. Your release authorities are not going to come through. All right, so that's why you need to update. So strictly speaking, you can only have 1 ESA, but in reality, this is part of the problem of the whole system is you can have multiple ESAs recorded, one with the tax office, one with the employer and one with BGL. So that's why I strongly emphasize you want to notify all the providers when you switch to have it as 1 ESA with all the different parties to it. Can I use a non-BGL ESA? Yes, you potentially could, but it's going to be a lot harder. And it will take you through why that's the case. We're populating all the fields. You'd have to do that outside the software and you'd have to really manually calc a lot of data. And then you'd have to store that data. But yes, there's nothing saying that if you use BGL software that you must use our ESA. Check on the ATO website. There hasn't been much movement of lately. There's really just the software providers and Australia Post. A lot of the other providers have got out when rollover came in. It just became too expensive to maintain. So just make sure you're checking on that website, but you could potentially use another provider. Important to turn on the notifications for contributions and rollovers, and you can put up to 2 registered contacts. We generally recommend that you put the accountant yourself as the notification when you set up the ESAs, that you put yourself, and you can put the trustee, or you can put yourself and the advisor as the 2 registered contacts. You can edit. We've made it a lot easier to edit who gets the notifications. And you can also split the notifications. We're looking to, this is a feature we're working on, so work in progress. In the next couple of releases, we're looking to be able to split. We've had requests from you guys to split the contribution notification from the rollovers, because we know the contributions can be a bit heavy. So we are working on a solution to split out the email notifications, so you could send maybe the contributions to the trustee, and you could send just the rollover notifications to the accounts. Not there yet, all right, coming soon. All right, so work in progress on that one. We are listening to you guys. It's just a fair bit of work to split that out. All right, so I'll just give a quick demo on how to register. This is logging into the software, just going into the Connect page, into the SuperStream dashboard, selecting all the funds here. So not registered is a little filter that you can do. Here you'll see where they're registered to. I've got some here still registered to Australia Post. So I'm going to select these as a batch, remembering I've got to update the ATO. You might want to, if you've got a batch of lodgements to do, you might want to go and check that the ESA is correct on the tax return, notify it, and then update them in a batch. So you need to notify the ATO or lodge with them, and then change the ESA. It's that simple. It'll then update all those to, you'll see these update in a sec. They'll update from Australia Post. Now they're all registered with BGL 360. Okay, so it's a fairly simple process. That's how you do it. All right, I've just got to click through manually. It looks like that slide's getting stuck. All right, so the other things is what you've got to do to get ready for SuperStream. This is just a handy tip. Before you do a rollover, make sure the fund's got a valid ABN. So you've got to, especially for new funds, make sure they've registered, filled out all the required forms and done the ABN. Make sure it's got a complying status. It's really got to have its lodgements up to date, no debts outstanding, because you can get removed from the regulated status or the complying status. So make sure that's the case before you do a rollover. Make sure the members' details are up to date. Sometimes you might have the wrong name on the member. It might be, a middle initial will be different. So make sure the details match what you've got before you do a rollover. And make sure, as I've mentioned, the fund has an ESA. So make sure it's registered with a provider, being BGL, that can support rollovers. All right, so this is how you update the records. You can ring the ATO, or the trustee can ring the ATO and change it. They can jump on the portal, or they can change the details with a paper form. Just be aware, if you've become non-compliant, it can take time. I've had clients that said it's taken 6 weeks to get that status reinstated. So just be aware of that. So that's pretty much it for me. I'm going to hand over to Anna now, who's going to take you through some of you may not have done a rollover. So Anna's going to take you through and the process, just so you're familiar with how to do one, and talk a bit about a little bit more detail in the rollover service. Anna, over to you.
Thanks, Matt. Now, in the SuperStream rollover process, there are 2 ATO validation services that the transferring fund must use prior to rolling out the member balance. The first service is the SMSF member verify, or SMSF member tick. Now, this service is required for all rollovers, including rollover to APRA fund and rollover to the SMSF. This service verifies the member details, including the TFN, the name, and the date of birth. Now, when this service returns an invalid response, it could be due to one of the following reasons. It could be because the member details that you provided in the message is incorrect, or the ATO system holds incorrect data. It could also be because of the TFN is either duplicate or flagged as compromised in the ATO system, or the ATO is unable to find a single match based on that TFN.
Anna, can you just make the slide full screen? I think you're just showing the wrong slide. Just control to the right, I think should make it work. That's it. Beautiful.
Thanks, Matt. Now, the second service is the SMSF verification service. Now, this service is only required if the receiving fund is an SMSF. Okay, this service verifies the SMSF status. Now, you can actually check the status of the SMSF by going to the Superfund lookup, and the status must be complying or registered, meaning that the SMSF is able to accept rollovers or contributions. The SVS also verifies that the member is the member of the SMSF and that there is no date of death exists from the member. It's also verified that the SMSF bank details and the electronic service address that you provided in the message must match with the ATO database. Now, how to set up these two services? Okay, if you lodge the tax return using SimpleFund 360, then these two services should already been set up. Okay, if you are lodging the tax return using a different tax software, then there are two steps required for you to set up these services. The first step is that you need to log into your Access Manager, and just under My Hosted SBR Software Services, you need to click on Notify the ATO of your hosted service and add the BGL software ID to grant BGL access to these two services. Now, the second step is to set up a lodging party in SimpleFund 360. Now, you can set it up as tax agent, business intermediary, or the trustee. Now, I have included an article with a step-by-step instruction on how to set up the lodging party in SimpleFund 360. The only thing that I want to emphasize is that when you set up the lodging party, you will need to include the ABN and the tax agent number if the lodging party is a tax agent. Now, you must ensure that these details match with your details in Access Manager for these two services to work. Okay, now when you're processing a rollout, when you submit the rollover transaction message, we will connect to the ATO validation service. If these two services return verified or valid response, we will send the message. You'll be able to see a confirmation on the screen that confirming the request has been sent. We have made a number of improvements to this confirmation message, which I will go through with you a little bit later in the demo. Now, on the other hand, if these service return invalid or non-verified response, then we would display the error response on the screen. And in that scenario, the member or the trustee of the receiving fund SMSF will need to contact the ATO to resolve any issue. And once it's resolved, you'll be able to resubmit the request. Now, you can also see the response from the ATO services in our new SuperStream Rollover and Release Authority report. Now, to view this report in SimpleFund 360 SuperStream Fund dashboard, just next to the transaction, just click on the Quick Action menu and select Export to PDF. Now, this report contains all the SuperStream data and is designed to assist with the year-end audit process. Now, apart from the essential information from the SuperStream message, including the member details, receiving fund, transferring fund details, and the transaction details. We also include the transaction history, which have the message movement when you receive the message, when you send the message, and who actioned it. It is designed to provide the evidence that you have actioned the message within the 3 days. When processing a rollout as a transferring fund, we will also include the response from the ATO services. Okay, that to provide the evidence that the transferring fund has validated the member and the receiving fund detail prior to rolling out the balance. Now, let's move on to the actual rollover process. Now, as Matt mentioned before, there are 3 options for the member to initiate a rollover. The member can initiate directly with the transferring fund or the receiving fund, or by submitting a request through the ATO online services. Okay. Now, with the roll-in process, there are 2 different scenarios or workflows. The receiving fund can initiate the roll-in request, or they can actually receive the roll-in transaction directly from the transferring fund. For processing a rollout, there are 3 different scenarios. The transferring fund can receive the rollout request from the receiving fund, or they can initiate the rollout transaction directly, or they can receive the rollout request from the ATO. Now, this is when the member log into the ATO online services and initiate from there. Now, let's move on to the demo. I will use the process when the receiving fund initiate the request and the transferring fund received process the request and respond back with the rollover transactions. Now, from the SuperStream dashboard, to initiate a request, you need to click on Request a Rollover and select Receiving Fund. Now, this will open up the rollover request modal. Now, when you select the member, we will populate the member details. Now, it's important to review these details because it will later be validated with the SMSF verified by the transferring fund. For the receiving fund details, we will populate the ABN and the name based on your fund details. And the ESA is BGL Asset 360. Now, you should have already notified the ATO of this ESA prior to submitting this message. The member client ID for an SMSF, it is optional. Now, for the bank account, we will give you a list of all the bank accounts that has been set up under control account 604 with the BSB and the account number. Now, you will need to select the correct unique bank account of the SMSF. And yet this bank account will be later validated with the SVS service by the transferring fund. Moving on to the transferring fund details section. Now, if the transferring fund is an APRA fund, when you enter a USI, we will connect to the fund validation service and pre-fill the ABN and the name. Now, it is important to use the detail returned from the fund validation service because most APRA gateway will have a validation to make sure that USI and ABN match prior to accepting the message. If the transferring fund is an SMSF, then you will need to fill in the information. Now, the ABN, and you also need to fill in the ESA and the fund name. Now for the rollover transaction details, you'll have the option to either request for the entire balance or for a specific amount. And the message sender contact details will give you a list of all the individuals that have been attached as the accountant in your fund relationship. Okay, so it will be a list of all the individuals and the attached representative in your fund relationship accountants. Okay, so once you submit the message, the transaction status will be roll in awaiting response. And we will send this message to the transferring fund. Now, if you have to contact the transferring fund to check on the progress of the request, to assist with the communication, we will display the conversation ID of the message in the transaction history, okay, in the next update. Okay, so to view the transaction history, you need to select actions and select view transaction history. Okay. Now, at the moment, this conversation ID is provided by our support team upon your request. But from the next update, you will be able to obtain this conversation ID. And when contacting the APRA fund, you can quote this conversation ID, and this will help them easily locate the message. Now moving on to the transferring fund. When the transferring fund received the request from the receiving fund, you see a rollout transaction type with the status as rollout request received. Okay. So you will need to review the details of the message and confirm that all details is correct. Now, the only thing that I want to mention is that with the bank account details, this message, if this message is coming from an SMSF, you will notice that the bank account details is including in the message. Now, if this request is coming from an APRA fund, however, you'll notice that the bank account is empty, and we have got a few support call about this. Now, this is correct because you are viewing the message from the APRA fund and they are not required to provide their bank details in the message. But once you process this message, we will connect to the fund validation service and we will pre-fill the bank account based on the ESA. Now, if there's any issue with the request, you have the option to reject this. Now, when you reject, you will need to select the standard errors specified by the ATO, and you can enter any further explanation for the rejection. When you click reject, we will send the error to the external fund, and the process, the workflow will end. Now, in order to continue with the rollover, either the receiving fund or transferring fund will need to initiate a new request. Now let's process this message. So once you process the message, we will try to match the member details in the message with a member of the fund based on the TFN or the first name or last name. Okay? If the TFN is not provided. Okay? Now, if the member in the fund has multiple accounts, you will need to select the account that you wish to roll out the balance. The receiving fund and transferring fund details will be populated based on the initial request from the receiving fund. Now, with the rollover transaction details, we will populate the taxable and tax-free balances and the preservation components based on the requested amount and the member balance of the fund. Now, if this request is for the entire balance, we will populate the account balance as at today's date. So you need to ensure that you have created entries a day prior to submitting the message to update the account balance. Now, when you submit the message and all the services has come back with the valid or verified response, we will send out the message and we will display a confirmation. Now, this message has been improved to include the member details, the external fund, and the bank account details. Okay. We also include the payment reference number. Now, you can download this message to PDF or copy to an email and send it to the trustee or the financial advisor. The payment will need to be done outside of SuperStream. And when making the payment, it is important that the payment reference number is used as the bank reference when sending the payment to the receiving fund. Now, moving back to the receiving fund, when the receiving fund received the rollover transaction from the transferring fund, you see a roll-in request with the status roll-in transaction received. And you will need to review the message, confirming all the information, and especially confirming that you have received the payment and the payment amount match with the payment amount in the message. Now, once you confirm that, you can process. Now, when you process this, we will send the outcome response to the transferring fund and the rollover is complete. We will also post the transaction to account 285 for the receiving fund. And for the transferring fund, we will post the transaction to account 460 once we receive the outcome response. Now, if you have a bank feed or if you enter the bank payment, then we will automatically match the SuperStream transaction with the bank transactions. Now, as I mentioned previously, as a transferring fund, you can initiate the rollover directly. To do that, you can click on request a rollover and select transferring fund. Okay. So then you will need to select the member and fill in the information for the receiving fund. Now again, if the receiving fund is an APRA fund, when you enter the USI, we will populate the bank account and the name based on the response from the fund validation service. Now, the rest of the process is similar to the previous workflow, so I won't repeat that. Now, when the member initiate the request from the ATO online service, then they will need to fill in a form with the transferring fund and receiving fund details. The ATO will do a pre-check for that. And once it's passed, they will send us the electronic portability form. Now, from the SuperStream dashboard, you will be able to see a transaction type see a message with the transaction type as rollout, with the status as rollout request received ATO. Okay. Now, the content of the message is very much similar to the request coming from the receiving fund, and the process of it also very similar. When you click on process, all the steps are the same. Okay. But if you are in the rare scenario, if you reject this message, the only thing difference is that when you reject this, we won't send back the error to the ATO or the receiving fund, because the ATOs simply don't handle this error. As the request is initiated by the member, all you need to do is to notify the member and arrange another request if it is required. Now, that is the SuperStream process in SimpleFund 360. Next, Matt will talk you through the SuperStream release authority. Back to you, Matt.
Thanks, Anna. I'll just share my screen again. getting lots of questions there, Anna. So I think we're going to have to answer some at the end. We might have to go a bit over time. But let's get back into SuperStream for now. You should be able to see my screen. So release authorities. This is also one of the benefits of moving to the new SuperStream standard and with BGL 360 is the release authorities. You know, the common ones you're going to get as an agent, certainly the Division 293 and probably, you know, at a lesser extent, some of the excess type notifications. And even, you know, I haven't seen many of the first home saver, super saver, but you might have some of those. So those can now become electronic. So if you set up BGL as ESA, how does it work is the next thing. So the common one I'll sort of go through is the Division 293. So it's not full end-to-end digital. Your trustee, if they have a Division 293 election form, so that's effectively, you know, where they're over the threshold and they've got to pay the extra 15% tax on their contributions. This is normally issued after the lodgement of their personal tax return and the SMSF returns being lodged. So you'll normally get notification from the ATO in some sort of email format. Then you've got the option to either pay that Division 293 from the own personal money or from the SMSF. If it's from the SMSF, you need to fill the online MyGov form or fill out the PDF. And then once that's lodged, you're saying you're going to withdraw that amount from the SMSF. The ATO will then check once they've got that form, that election form that you're planning to do that, they're going to check the ESA. If that's BGL's ESA, because it's been updated on the ATO portal, then the message, rather than going through on email or paper, it's now going to come through to the software. Right. Once that's come through the software, you've then got to action it and then make the payment. Okay, so that's how the process works. If there's no electronic service address registered, or let's heaven forbid say it's one like Macquarie Bank, I saw in the questions, if you've still got Macquarie Bank as your ESA provider, then that's where the problem's going to occur. They're going to switch to paper. They won't be able to send the release authority through the electronic means. You'll never get it into BGL software if the ESA is still with Macquarie Bank, for example. I'm not having a go at Macquarie Bank, but I know they don't support the rollovers or release authorities. So what's that look like in the software? What you'll see is if you jump into the software again, where Anna was in the SuperStream dashboard, here, as soon as you come in, you'll see any outstanding messages that need your action. They'll sit in this message box here. And here you'll see one of those is I've got to do a release authority. So in here, I've got two release authorities, first home saver and a Division 293. So the member's done the election form. They want the money coming out of the SMSF. It's now come into the software. You would have got an email for that as well. You'll see here, electronic received, got all the details. Most of this will be pre-populated for you. You just want to select a contact. In this case, it's just got the ATO here as a contact. They're the ones that handle this. And then you just click process. So you confirm the details are all correct. Click process. Now you're approving the release authority. Next thing you'll get, it's pretty quick. You'll get this payment reference number. Okay, you can put the contact details in this part of the form because this, if anything goes wrong with a payment, you might want to put yourself here. You may want to put the trustee here. I'll leave that up to you, but just be aware if the ATO has any issues, and we have seen some issues with the release authorities. I'll talk a few tips and tricks at the end. But that reference number, again, like what Anna told you for the rollovers, that's critical. The payment system connecting to the SuperStream system, that's the whole way it's supported. If you don't put the right reference number in when you pay the amount out of the super fund, all right, and you go on to internet banking, you put that payment reference number in there, and that's how it ties it back. So the ATO now sees the payment, and you don't want to get a payment lost at the ATO. If you put the wrong digit in by one digit, or you don't put it in, you're going to have to be chasing the ATO. Not something you want to be waiting on hold for. put the payment reference number in, save and submit, and then that's completed. I wanted to give you. Just try to help you and steer you in, just based on my experience talking to a lot of clients and Anna dealing with a lot of the things that have gone wrong. Make sure, particularly the ones that are the most troublesome, the ones dealing with APRA funds. Okay, SMSF to SMSF generally works pretty well as long as both SMSF have got an ESA and it's valid, and when it's a BGL 360 to BGL 360 ESA, you're generally not going to have any issues. When it goes to APRA, what you've got to be cautious of, make sure you check, triple check the USI, double check the casing of the USI. This is just something we found out recently, that most people, well, the standard of the SuperStream standard says you can put uppercase or lowercase USI. All right, let me show you an example. I think it's better if I show you in the software. Let's just go back to this dashboard. Here in this fund, I'm going to select one that's got a rollover transaction prepared and the ESI here. So this is what I'm talking about. I'm going to paste in a Hester ESI and make sure you click this retrieve bank details. All right, it's going to then populate all these details. We're basically getting this from the APRA service. They run this service called the Super Validation Service, Fund Validation Service, I should say, FVS. And they have got a requirement to keep this all up to date. What you've got to be careful of, what I mentioned there, is if this is lowercase, right? They only found this out recently. It will still pass all the validations, right? But there is one or two, and I won't name them, I'm tempted to, but there's one or two that won't accept that. Their system will reject a lowercase, anything with a lowercase in. So we're forcing in our next update, we only learnt this recently, we're going to force it. If you put in something like that, we're even going to just change it to uppercase. 98% of those will accept lowercase, but I don't want you to be one of those 2%. So that's why I'm giving you this tip. Put the USI, which identifies the APRA fund, and always click this retrieve bank account details. Don't change the ABN. I know you've got to trust this service, but you're much better trusting this service. I've seen clients where they've changed the ABN because they've gone onto the website. All right, we're checking whether it's valid, but you may put accidentally in, you may put a valid ABN in, but it's not actually the funds, APRA funds ABN. It might be the holding company. It might be a level above that you've put in the ABN. Again, you're going to be lost in the world of pain that is chasing up the APRA fund for that payment. Okay, so you're better off always to double check, put in the correct here and retrieve. It's going to populate all these details for you. Leave the bank account details as is. It's up to the APRA fund to make sure these records are up to date. Okay, so that's just something I wanted to hone in as a tip and trick. It'll get you out of trouble if you rely more on the service. Also, Access Manager, I saw a lot of questions in the chat. If you don't use ATO, if you don't use BGL for the lodgements, as Anna mentioned, you might have an issue verifying. So it's when you're the transferring fund. So if you're transferring from an SMSF to another SMSF, it's going to make sure it's going to have to validate, and it's going to need you to set up the BGL software as a lodging party. All right, you can have multiple lodging parties. So you can be using Xero as a lodging party. So you can lodge your SMSF returns through there, and you can set up BGL as a lodging party. Even if you don't lodge through BGL, you still want to lodge through Xero, we recommend you set up a software so you can lodge, because then what Anna was showing you is the verification service will then work and be able to enable you to verify the SMSFs are verified, okay? We use that same service for lodging and for verifying, okay? You can have multiple software providers using Access Manager. It's not an issue. All right, so that's the first page of tips. Next one, Anna's covered a few of these, so I'll go through them pretty quickly. Receiving, when you're rolling money into an SMSF, just make sure the bank account details are up to date with the ATO. All right, generally you're updating the ATO details when you lodge an annual return, but if you haven't lodged an annual return, if it's a new fund, you're going to need to go on to the ATO portal and put the bank account details in, all right? So make sure the bank account details are in there. The APRA funds are checking those bank account details, but quite often the APRA funds are also asking for extra, even though they've verified that those bank account details are on the ATO verification service, a lot of you are facing it where they're asking for extra evidence. So they're wanting for things like verified bank statements or, signed bank statements, stuff like that. They're wanting to pass their KYC requirements. KYC, know your client. So they're doing extra steps. We're working with APRA funds and the SMSF Association to make sure those steps are more standardized. But if you're dealing with your client, it's best to make sure they're, dealing with the APRA funds, make sure they've got some bank statements set up with the name of the fund correct, because the APRA fund will reject it. Rolling SMSF to APRA, ABN needs to match. I've explained that. Make sure you've put in the correct USI details. Payment woes. This is what we're still working on with APRA and the ATO. You've got to use internet banking. So I saw a lot of questions in the chat. It's unfortunately BGL can't get into the payment system. SuperStream is separate from the payment standards. So the payment standards under SuperStream says you must use internet banking and you must use BSB and account number, okay? So that's why every time you're making a payment, there's always a payment reference number, as Anna's shown you, there's always BSB and bank account details. The standard says in the legislation, it says, or in the requirements, it says you must use a BEX payment standard. BEX is bank, all the major banks use it, but we have seen some of the smaller banks use what's known as OSCO, which is a newer payment standard. It's run by PayID. You can still put through OSCO payment reference numbers, but we have had some clients have problems when they're using OSCO, which is one of the internet banking standards. It's generally with the neobanks. The smaller banks may use this service, but we have seen some of the major, like CommBank, use this payment standard as well. You can still put BSB and account numbers in those systems, but just be aware sometimes some APRA funds, and we have had notification if you're doing a Division 293, that you may have to ring the ATO if you're using, so you've put in the BSB of the ATO's payment details, but you've used OSCO rather than the traditional payment standard. Maybe that was your only option. The ATO is telling us at the moment, you've got to ring the ATO if you've done a Division 923 payment. We're working with the SMSF Association to try to make the ATO update their system to support the OSCO payment system. It's still a transfer, it's still an internet bank transfer, but strictly speaking, the ATO is saying, well, you've got to use BEX, but we're finding sometimes you may not have a choice with some of the smaller banks. So just be aware of that. If you've got a choice, try to use, just ask the bank, is it a BEX, or ask your client, is it a BEX payment standard? Make sure they're using BSB and make sure you're using payment reference number. You're going to have a lot less issues. So I wanted to give you those tips. Moving ESA, I've sort of touched on this already. Moving ESA, you can notify the ATO through the annual return process. Just make sure before you lodge the annual return, you've got the ESA set as BGL first there. And as Anna mentioned, also the conversation ID. That's coming soon. If you do have a problem with a payment, we can, if you ring up our support team, we can give you the conversation ID. We're going to make that available in the software in the next release so that you won't have to go through and ring support. But at the moment, just be aware if you've got a payment stuck in the ether, ring up our support team. They'll help you find the conversation ID so you can deal with APRA. And soon we'll make that available inside the software. That's something we've learned more recently, that the APRA funds are finding that useful. So that's something we're going to add to the software. That's pretty much it for today's session. Thank you for attending. Really, just in summary, just try to be on the front foot with your clients. Try to make sure that the ATO records are up to date and getting, before you do any sort of rollovers or release authorities, you're going to have a lot less hassle. And also, we've given you a few tips just on payments and switching ESAs. Try to get that payment reference number. It's critical to get that right. So that's pretty much it from me and Anna. We will take a short break. I know there's been lots of questions. Thank you for those that have got to get to lunch or whatever your next appointment is. Thank you for attending today. There will be a survey, so just please give us some positive feedback. This was Anna's first session. She's done an amazing job. And we'll be back in about a minute or two just to answer any burning questions. So get your questions lined up, and me and Anna will spend about 5 minutes trying to cover the most burning ones. Thank you very much. We'll pause now for a minute or two. All right, we might wrap it up. There's not many new questions coming up. Thank you very much for your time today. We hope we've given you some guidance with this process. As I mentioned, we will send a recording of this and you will get a copy of the slides. So thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you, everyone.